Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, just wait a sec. I think I gotta just get my settings right.
Sure, sure.
Test speaker. Okay, I should be able to hear you now.
Okay, okay, great. Am I coming in now?
Yep, I can see you.
Okay, excellent, great. Thanks, appreciate it. Well, thank you for taking your time out to agree to be interviewed. I've heard you are
Sure.
the guy to ask about the situation in Yemen. So, as I understand, you're in Sydney, Australia.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I heard you guys had a very strict lockdown this past year, especially in Brisbane. I think you posted a few things about it.
Yeah, I think it was the most severe in the area that I was in. So yeah, it was a lot of people didn't like it because there was no time limit to it. I mean, I can understand like a 2 week lockdown at the very beginning when we don't know much about the virus, but for it to just go on and on and on, a lot of people were pissed off with that, and perfectly understandable.
Right, right. It's interesting. Okay, about the situation in Yemen, it's something that few people in the US know much about, and there's relatively little coverage of it in the mainstream media, of course, but even in alternate media, very little. Richard Midhurst is one guy who talks about it, but I haven't heard many people say about it. Right now. Ukraine gets all the attention, and what I've
Mm,
heard, Yemen is probably the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world right now, but few
yep.
people know exactly what's going on. So
Can
I
I
wonder if you could first go through a little bit of the history of Yemen.
can I just ask, right? I
Sure,
mean, are
go
we
ahead.
recording?
Yeah,
Are we
yeah, I'm sorry. Yes,
recording?
it is recording. I should have asked first.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that would have been good. To know. But please continue.
Yeah, sure. I should have told you. Usually informs people, right? Okay, but yeah, as far as Yemen goes, as I understand, it was if you could talk a little bit about the history of it. So I understand it was a part of the Ottoman Empire way back for a time. Many ancient civilizations were in that region. Part of the Ottoman Empire. Then the British had Aden, a coaling port for their ships going to India, whatever.
Hmm.
And then there was in South Yemen, there was a Marxist-Leninist group for a time, but there was a civil war and they reunited. North Yemen, South Yemen reunited. And I wonder if you could, what was some of the stuff going on in that period?
Okay, so yeah, you're right. There was a time when Yemen was divided between two empires. The north was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and the south was controlled by Britain. The majority of the population, about 80%, lives in the north, and the rest lives in the south. And then what happened is that the Ottoman Empire collapsed. There was a power vacuum. The Saudis invaded in 1934 and annexed the provinces of Baha Asir, Jizan, and Najran, which are today a part of Saudi Arabia. The rest of Yemen remained under British occupation until 1967, when there was a revolution led by the communists of South Yemen against Britain, and they established a Marxist-Leninist state. In North Yemen, there was a civil war from 1962 to 67, and that was between the imamate, that is the Zaydi imamate, that had become corrupt and unpopular. And so naturally, they got the support of Saudi Arabia, and they fought against the Republicans, who were supported by Egypt under President Gamal Abdel Nasser. The Republicans won the civil war, and that's how the Republic of North Yemen was formed. The most important event, I'd say, in terms of understanding what's happening now, would be the assassination of President Ibrahim al-Hamdi in 1977, which then paved the way for the 34-year presidency of Ali Abdullah Saleh. And he was the president up until the so-called Arab Spring, which was in 2011, 2012. Now, in hindsight, it's very easy to look at the Arab Spring and understand that it was an attempt by Turkey and Qatar to bring Muslim Brotherhood governments to power, but only in the Arab republics, not the Arab monarchies. And so that's why Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Libya, and of course Yemen were targeted for the Arab Spring.
Okay.
So that basically sets up the situation leading up to the Arab Spring.
Okay, interesting. Would you see the Arab Spring movement as essentially a color revolution or a series of color revolutions, or is that too?
Yeah, they used a lot of the hybrid warfare tactics that you'd expect. They mobilized the media in particular. So Al Jazeera was mobilized in every single Arab republic to promote the protests, and of course, the protests were against these governments for legitimate reasons: corruption, unemployment, poverty, you name it. In Syria, they were relatively small. In Yemen, they're actually quite big. Because Yemen, of all the Arab republics, had the most corrupt and nepotistic government. But the thing is, Yemen wasn't really a part of the script, and that's because the government of Yemen, the government of President Ali Abdullah Saleh, was quite agreeable to Saudi Arabia and also quite agreeable to the United States. So it was actually a bit of an accident that the Ansarullah movement, also known as the Houthis, ended up taking power in Yemen.
Okay. Okay. So they seem like now the president the Saudis supported turned against them at one point.
That's true. That's true. In 2017, he was okay. No, sorry. 2017 is when he was killed. But before that, in 2014, that's when the Ansarullah movement took over the capital, Sana'a, and it was a bloodless revolution.
Okay.
And so I would really stress that the main force behind the revolution was Ansarullah. The former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, had nothing to do with it. In fact, Ali Abdullah Saleh from 2004 to 2010 was waging war against the Ansarullah movement. And it's important to remember here that Ansarullah did not take up arms against the Yemeni state. It's the Yemeni state that took up arms against Ansarullah. Ansarullah represented a political challenge to the Yemeni status quo and to the policy of supporting Wahhabis within Yemen, which is a policy that President Saleh had pursued with the support of Saudi Arabia. So if you look back at the 1980s, when there was the so-called jihad against the socialist government of Afghanistan, which was Afghanistan at the time was allied with the Soviet Union, and of course the Soviet Union sent troops to defend that government. Yemen was a recruiting ground, so Saudi Arabia would send Wahhabi preachers to recruit Yemenis who were, extremely poor, to fight in Afghanistan. They became part of the Arab Mujahideen contingent. And then when they came back to Yemen, they brought Al Qaeda with them. And first, they were mobilized against the Socialists of South Yemen. So they carried out hundreds of assassinations. And as a result, the Yemeni Socialist Party was terrorized into submission. And then from 2004 onwards, they were deployed alongside the Yemeni army under President Ali Abdullah Saleh to wage war against Ansarullah. And so 6 wars were waged against Ansarullah. The leader of Ansarullah, Sayyid Hussein al-Houthi, was murdered on the orders of President Ali Abdullah Saleh. So there's no love between Saleh and Ansarullah. It just so happened that in 2014, the people of Yemen were fed up with the government of Abdurrab Mansour Hadi, who had replaced Saleh. So there was like a regime change within the government that was already friendly to Saudi Arabia and already friendly to the United States. The Saudis and the GCC stepped in and they told Saleh to step down, and they replaced him with Hadi. But the only reason they replaced him with Hadi is because Hadi wanted to preside over the federalization of Yemen into 6 different regions, which would then allow Saudi Arabia to control them easily and cut oil deals with the parts of Yemen that have all of the natural resources but very small populations, which would then be at the expense of the parts of Yemen that have the majority of the population. So that's what happened. And so the people rose up against that government, and they looked towards Ansarullah to lead that revolution. And so Ansarullah was acting in the interests of, well, I mean, this is the Yemeni Interior Ministry. The Yemeni army basically said that Ansarullah was acting in the interests of the homeland, in the interests of Yemen, because they were pursuing an economically nationalist agenda, because they were opposed to the IMF reforms that Yemen was asked to implement under Hadi, which caused fuel prices to skyrocket. And they were against the attempts to divide Yemen into 6 regions. That's why the revolution happened. And so under those conditions, because Saleh wanted to come back to power, he said, oh, I'm also on the side of the revolution. So he was just being an opportunist. He was pretty much marginalized by that point.
Okay, yeah, interesting. How would you describe the politics or the ideology of Ansarullah?
It's a combination of Zaidi revivalism
Okay.
and Arab nationalism.
Okay.
So Zaidi revivalism is it's Zaydis are kind of like the Sunnis of the Shia and the Shia of the Sunnis.
Okay.
But politically, in many ways, they're aligned with the Shia political movements in the Middle East, and that goes back to the history of Islam. You know, the Shiites, their identity kind of it emerges following the assassination of the fourth Caliph,
Right.
Ali ibn Abi Talib, and they were against the kind of the takeover of the Islamic Empire at that time by Muawiyah, and then Muawiyah in the history of Islam represents corruption, represents
Mhm.
greed. He represented the interests of the rich, whereas Ali ibn Abi Talib is considered to be one of the most just caliphs. And so, there is a kind of pro-egalitarian, almost socialist ethos to uh, revolutionary Shiite traditions across the Middle East, particularly in Yemen.
Okay.
And so, if you compare them to for example, right-wing like Yemeni opinion, which is like against socialism, the Ansarullah movement historically has been quite friendly towards socialist politics in Yemen. And on top of that, they are Arab nationalists. So they don't see themselves as antagonistic to the Arab nationalist ideology that won the civil war back in 1967. They see themselves as wanting to continue the best aspects of Arab nationalism. So it's a combination of Zaidi Shia revivalism with Arab nationalism.
Okay. Interesting. What is the relationship, or do they have any relationship with the Yemen Socialist Party? Is there any connection there?
The Yemen Socialist Party actually split. So there's a faction of the Yemen Socialist Party which is like called the Yemeni Socialists Against Aggression, and they are aligned with the government in Sana'a, and the government in Sana'a includes a coalition, and the largest faction within that coalition is Ansarullah. So Ansarullah is part of a political coalition that supports the government in Sana'a, and so there is like a faction of socialists that support that government. There's also another faction of socialists which retains the name Yemeni Socialist Party, and they've got the blue flag with the red star. And they are supported by the UAE. They don't really have a lot of power. Like they want to secede from Yemen. They want the old South Yemen back,
Okay.
and the UAE is supporting them. So the UAE is supporting them. And they're supportive of like getting back their state essentially, but they don't really have a lot of power. In fact, they're being dominated in the south by Al Qaeda militias and other Salafist militias that get a lot more funding from the UAE than they do.
Okay, that's interesting. What is the military situation? My understanding, the Ansarullah controls most of Yemen. They've kind of beaten back Saudi Arabia to an extent. Is that true? They've actually had an attack on Saudi Arabia itself, I think about a year ago.
Oh, not a year ago. I mean, like just this year, there were attacks on the oil facilities in Jeddah, which is like which is a fuel depot. So one of the strategies of the Yemeni national resistance. So mind you, whenever I say Yemeni national resistance, I'm talking about the Ansarullah-backed government in the
Right.
capital of Yemen, Sana'a.
Right.
One of the tactics of the Yemeni national resistance has been to go after Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure because that's the backbone of the Saudi economy.
Right.
Within Yemen itself, they've taken back many areas in the north, which are on the borders of Saudi Arabia. The current battle is over Ma'rib. Ma'rib is the last kind of major Saudi garrison within northern Yemen, the former North Yemen. And so if the Saudis lose that, then they're going to lose the war. I mean, I've read reports about, the Saudi generals who are responsible for commanding the forces in Ma'rib, and they wear civilian clothing. They don't wear their military uniforms because they're afraid. They're afraid that they're going to be targeted by the people living there because there's a lot of sympathy, for the Yemeni national resistance even in Ma'rib. So that's a long drawn out fight. The Saudis have overwhelming military force because a lot of this war is not being fought on the ground, between two armies in this kind of attritional way. The Saudi way of war is to starve the entire country as a means of trying to bring the Ansarullah movement to heel. 377,000 Yemenis have died as a result of the Saudi blockade. 70% of that number are children under the age of 5, and 60% of them died of starvation and disease. This is how Saudi Arabia wages war. They're not waging this war in any kind of honorable way. The honorable way of waging war would be not to blockade the country, and to fight, direct battles so that it's only between soldiers. But if that happened, then Saudi Arabia would lose, and that's because they rely on mercenaries that are drawn from all over the world. And the thing about mercenaries is that they fight for money. They're not fighting for a cause. They're not fighting for their land. They're not fighting for their country. They're fighting for money, which is why Saudi Arabia needs expensive equipment drawn from all over the world to help these soldiers survive on the battlefield.
Right.
Whereas the Yemenis have a much greater willingness to die, and that's why they're winning.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. Wow. So my understanding, there have been periodic truces. There's a truce right now, actually, but the blockade hasn't ended. The Saudis still have the really horrific blockade. But is there a truce going on right now, or maybe for the past week or so? A ceasefire, maybe?
There was a ceasefire that was announced for the holy month of Ramadan.
Okay. Okay.
But the thing is, the Saudis are not lifting the blockade. They're simply saying that they're not going to fight.
Okay.
And so, as far as the Yemeni national resistance is concerned, the war is still on. They might get respite for the period of Ramadan, but there's no guarantee that the war isn't going to continue after the holy month. So, things haven't really changed. One of the major changes, however, is that I just said things haven't changed. Then I said one of the major changes, but it's a sign of like the weakness of the Saudi bargaining position, because the so-called president of Yemen. Oh, okay. This is actually going to need a little bit more background. So let's ask ourselves, what is the Saudi claim to legitimacy for blockading and starving Yemen? Saudi Arabia is claiming to act on behalf of the legitimate government of Yemen. That is the government of President Hadi. The problem is that Hadi does not live in Yemen. Hadi lives in Saudi Arabia. In fact, ever since the Saudi intervention began back in 2015, Hadi has lived in Riyadh. He probably lives in some like hotel. And in fact, there were reports coming out from the Associated Press, and it was reported by Al Jazeera back in 2017 that President Hadi was under house arrest in Saudi Arabia. Can you imagine like Saudi Arabia is claiming that they're intervening in Yemen on behalf of a legitimate president who they've kept under house arrest in their own capital city? That would be like Russia intervening in Syria on behalf of President Assad while imprisoning Assad in Moscow. That would be like an equivalent type of situation. So there's no legitimacy. I mean, if you just think about it ethically, morally, there's no legitimacy to this arrangement, because you'd expect that if a country is intervening in another country on behalf of the government because that government asked them to, then at the very least, the president of the government that's requesting the intervention is located in that country, which isn't the case. But anyway, what happened over the past month is that Saudi Arabia, they announced that Hadi was no longer the president, that the authority of the presidency had shifted to a council made up of people who presumably the Saudis have appointed, because there's clearly no elections within Yemen that would result in those people having any position of power. And so the very kind of basis for the Saudi intervention in Yemen, which is that they're acting on behalf of Hadi, and that Hadi was the president of Yemen, even that doesn't exist anymore. There's some presidential council made up of non-entities. It's important for people to remember that the war on Yemen is actually legal, not illegal. It is legal, legal, in the eyes of the United Nations, because of UN Resolution 2216, which says that the Saudis are acting on behalf of the legitimate government of Yemen. And the reason that that resolution was passed was because Hadi wrote a letter to the Saudis, and the Saudis got France, Britain, and the United States to table that letter at the UN Security Council, basically saying, look, the Yemenis want us to help them defeat the Houthis. But the problem is that the The premise of that letter is that the president of Yemen was Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, even though he had resigned 2 months before that resolution was passed at the UN Security Council. And the only reason it passed is because Russia and China refused to veto it. Russia and China could have vetoed that resolution, thereby, at the very least, making the war on Yemen illegal, but they chose not to, thereby legalizing the war on Yemen in the eyes of the UN Security Council. And so I don't mince my words. Russia and China do have blood on their hands.
Why do you think they abstained? Why do you think they did not veto it?
Number one, China requires Saudi oil for their economy because they're an extremely oil dependent economy.
Okay.
Number two is Russia. Russia and Saudi Arabia are similar in the sense that they're both energy exporters. And so Russia has an interest in collaborating with Saudi Arabia on oil prices because they both have an interest, especially with this current Russian special military operation. Really, it's an invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They have an interest in keeping oil prices high in order to prosecute their wars. Regardless of what you think about the Russian war in Ukraine, that is the realpolitik of the situation. Russia and Saudi Arabia want to keep oil prices high. And so that's why I say to people in the West who are against the Russian intervention in Ukraine, which, by the way, I don't think is necessarily objectionable. I mean, from a Western point of view, I'd like the West not to punish Russia for what it's done in Ukraine, and I think the animosity towards Russia should be for abstaining on that UN resolution 2216. But the problem is if you're gonna condemn Russia for abstaining in resolution 2216, then you'd have to condemn France, the United States, and Britain even more because they're the ones who tabled the motion on behalf of Saudi Arabia. So that's the Saudi reason, essentially. That's the Russian rationale, is that they have their geopolitical priorities. Because you have to remember that Russia is on the receiving end of aggression as well. I mean, the reason why the war in Ukraine happened is because of the long-standing NATO policy of trying to aggressively contain and weaken Russia. That's why the Ukraine war happened. And also in Syria, I mean, for a period of about 10 years, NATO had an active policy alongside the GCC, including Saudi Arabia, but also like Israel as a part of this coalition to dislodge the Syrian government, which was against Russia's interest because Russia has a naval presence in Tartus, which is like a coastal city on the Mediterranean in Syria. Yeah. And so Russia feels like they're being aggressed upon from all sides. And so they don't want to make enemies. If they can minimize the number of enemies, then they can serve their interests the best. And so, to antagonize Russia by vetoing UN Resolution 2216 back in 2015 would have meant antagonizing Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia has the power alongside the UAE to drive down oil prices because they have a very low cost of production. Which is what the United States wants them to do right now. So the US now is running to Saudi Arabia and saying, you have to increase oil production. And they're saying exactly the same thing to the UAE. But Saudi Arabia and the UAE are refusing to drive down oil prices by increasing production because they have this they have this agreement, unofficial agreement with Russia that they're going to keep oil prices high. And that way, both Russia and the Gulf states that are involved in Yemen, so the UAE and Saudi Arabia, can prosecute their wars.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, as I understand, Saudi Arabia recently agreed to sell oil to China in yuan, which is a kind of interesting development. So some interesting stuff going on. Yeah, do you think about Syria, do you think it would be accurate to say that the Russians prevented Syria from going the way of Libya?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that.
I think so.
I have a Syrian flag behind me.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, about Yemen. What is the role of the US and the West in the Saudi war in Yemen? How is the US facilitating that?
They are arming the Saudis. That's the most important thing. They're assisting in the blockade because there's the US Navy there policing the blockade. and they've deployed Patriot missiles to Saudi Arabia. They withdrew the American personnel who were operating the Patriot missiles back in September last year. But that's the extent of the U.S. support. It's major. It's the arming of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia would not be able to prosecute this war against Yemen effectively without the support of the United States, especially all of the logistics, the radars. You can imagine there's absolutely it's absolutely the case that Saudi Arabia has American military personnel holding their hands through this operation, because Saudi military personnel are not known for their competence. And I'll give you an example of this. I mean, back in 2017, I remember listening to an American general who said that he wasn't specific because he didn't want to embarrass the Saudis, but it's very obvious that he was talking about Saudi Arabia. He said, he was talking about the Yemeni conflict, and he was saying that we have allies in the Middle East who are using missiles that cost $2 million to shoot down Yemeni drones that cost $200. So this is actually the Saudis have spent something in the order of like over $350 billion to wage this war. And that's because no war in human history has made use of this many ballistic missiles. Interceptor missiles, and that's because the Yemenis have pioneered the art of drone and ballistic missile warfare themselves. So the way that this works is that the Yemeni resistance will send drones that cost maybe $200 to $1,000 to max $5,000 each into Saudi airspace. And their job would be to just swarm and overwhelm the Patriot missiles. And so the Patriot missiles have to shoot these drones, because if they don't, one of these drones can like smash into their radars, and then these missile systems, these Patriot missile systems, which are already very expensive, would become inoperable because they become completely blind if they don't have a radar. Right. And then once the Patriot missile isn't operating anymore, the Yemenis have like a period of a few hours to launch a barrage of ballistic missiles at Saudi oil facilities. And so, quite a few get through. So that's been the Yemeni way of war. The Yemenis are able to force the Saudis to bleed like, millions of dollars. Just imagine it costs you maybe about $10,000 to send a bunch of drones to overwhelm a Patriot missile battery. And every single missile that the Patriot shoots costs about $2.3 million.
Wow, interesting. Little bit like the NLF in the Vietnam War against the U.S. against U.S. imperialism. What is the role of does Iran play a role in this? How close are they?
Not as much as people claim they do.
Okay.
We got to remember that there's a blockade, like like a vicious, cruel blockade on Yemen. So every single ship that docks at Hodeidah port is checked for weapons. Like this is it's pretty savage. And so how is it that that people keep claiming that Iran is supporting the Yemeni resistance with weapons? I mean, it's very, very difficult. I think there is, however, some qualitative support. So if you look at the Yemeni ballistic missile arsenal, they do resemble Iranian equipment. And of course, Iranian equipment is, borrowed and reverse engineered from Chinese equipment and Russian equipment. And so most likely the blueprints, the technology is coming through into Yemen. There's probably, intelligent people, could be from Iran, could be from Lebanon, could be from Iraq, could be from Syria, could be from North Korea, who knows, coming into Sana'a to teach the Yemeni resistance how to build these missiles. Or it could just be the Yemenis themselves, because they are educated people. They have educated people among them whose job it is to reverse engineer military technology. I mean, these days with the internet, it's not that hard. It's basically just the knowledge, the technology that you need to get from somewhere, I guess. And of course, a few very specific qualitative parts, that you need. So you might be able to build 95% of the frame of like a missile or something, but you might need some specific part, which is very high value. And then maybe only that gets smuggled in. But the overwhelming majority of the conventional weapons in the Yemeni resistance arsenal comes from the Yemeni army. This is old Soviet equipment that's been a part of the Yemeni army for a very long time. The reason why people think that the Houthis are being funded by Iran, to the extent that they do, um, or the extent to which people think that the Ansarullah movement, the Yemeni national resistance, is funded by Iran, is simply because of the propaganda that's needed to justify the Saudi intervention, because the Saudis needed to claim that Yemen was being attacked by some foreign force, and so their strategy was to say that the Houthis are basically just Iranian proxies, which isn't true. They're 100% indigenous to Yemen. They are 100% Yemeni. Meanwhile, the forces mobilized by Saudi Arabia are 84% foreign. So the side that's overwhelmingly foreign is claiming to act on behalf of the legitimate government of Yemen against Iranian-backed proxies, even though these Iranian-backed proxies are 100% Yemeni, and overwhelming majority of their arsenal is from the Yemeni army.
Mhm. That's interesting. Where do the Saudi soldiers come from?
Sudan, many African countries, Sudan, Senegal, many of them are from Egypt, but really all over the Muslim world. There's about 100,000 Saudi soldiers as well. A lot of the frontline fighting is done by Yemenis who are paid by Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
And there's also Al Qaeda mercenaries. So the governor of Ma'rib is the brother of the Al Qaeda emir, who's also based in Ma'rib. So there's close coordination and collaboration between Saudi Arabia, Al Qaeda, and mercenaries drawn from all over the world.
Right. That's interesting.
Particularly the Muslim world. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Interesting. Do you see any possibility of change if Saudi Arabia moves closer to Russia or China? Any shift?
That's the kind of terrifying scenario, actually, because Yemen really is being sacrificed for the sake of this multipolar world that's emerging right now, because Saudi Arabia is cooperating with Russia and China, and so Russia and China have no reason to oppose Saudi Arabia, even while Saudi Arabia is committing a genocide.
Right.
And I wish many people on our side, many people who are pro-Russia, or at the very least, oppose the NATO expansion that caused Russia to invade Ukraine. I wish many of these people would speak about this as well. But at the same time, it presents an opportunity. One way that this war can end is if the US realizes that the money that's being wasted by Saudi Arabia in prosecuting this war in Yemen would be much better spent propping up the US dollar by buying US Treasury bonds. That's one thing. The other thing would be, if Saudi Arabia were to stop waging war on Yemen, then they could actually afford to drop oil prices. And so I would like to see activists put more pressure on the US government with the argument that it's quite a kind of realpolitik Machiavellian argument that you can make. You can say, look, let's suppose you want to punish Russia, and Russia right now relies on high oil prices. Well, why don't you convince Saudi Arabia, use all of your diplomatic pressure, use all of your humanitarian agencies, because Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, they are dominated by American lobbyists, who are kind of affiliated with the State Department. I think there's plenty of evidence for that. Use all of those like soft power forces to convince Saudi Arabia to stop its war on Yemen. And if they do that, then they can actually afford to drop oil prices, which will punish Russia.
Right.
So it's like there's a way in which you can actually punish Russia by helping the Yemeni people, and that's what I'm interested in.
Right. Interesting. There seems to be a slight rift between the Biden administration and Saudi Arabia, particularly due to the Khashoggi murder. A few weeks, he was very well connected with the Democratic Party. And so some people in the Biden administration are angry at Saudi Arabia. But how wide is that rift? Do you see it going anywhere? Anything coming out of it?
The rift, I believe, is an extension of the rift between Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood Alliance.
Okay.
So the Muslim Brotherhood Alliance refers to Turkey and Qatar.
Mhm,
So these are the two kind of states that are part of this bloc. Al Jazeera is part of the Muslim Brotherhood Alliance.
mhm.
Jamal Khashoggi is associated with this pro-Turkey, pro-Qatari Muslim Brotherhood faction.
Okay.
And he is actually, I believe, half Turkish. So Saudi Arabia doesn't like that faction, like Turkey and Qatar, because there is like rivalry just like within like the Sunni world can be mobilized against Shia, against the Shia axis, which was like what happened in Syria. So the Muslim Brotherhood Alliance and Saudi Arabia were joined against, the axis of resistance, which is, Shia Iran, pro Iraq, which is like, got a lot of, Iranian backed militias, the Shia militias in Iraq, but also the government of Syria, which is a part of the resistance axis. And of course, like I don't want to undermine the ability of your channel to continue functioning. So,
Sure, sure.
the boys in green and gold in Lebanon,
Sure.
like if you know what I'm talking about.
Sure, sure. I
So
understand the point.
yeah,
Good.
yeah.
Interesting.
So like so long as like that was the conflict, it was so long as the conflict was between NATO, the GCC, and Israel on the one hand, and the resistance axis on the other. Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood Alliance, they could cooperate, and they were coordinating their efforts to try and overthrow the Syrian government. Once the Syrian government showed that it could resist and managed to like beat off all of these conspiracies against it, the old rift, the rift between the Muslim Brotherhood Alliance and Saudi Arabia started to reemerge.
Interesting.
And I think really it's because they have different geopolitical interests. I mean, Qatar has like more of an interest in collaborating with Iran because they share the same kind of energy resources in the Persian Gulf.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and uh, and yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of reasons, right? But like generally I think it comes down to the fact that they lost in Syria, and so they now have different foreign policies on how to deal with the outcome.
Right, interesting. Yes, the US still occupies 40% of Syria, geographically, as I understand. One of the
Yeah.
reasons is to deny Syria the oil revenue for rebuilding. Yeah.
That's right.
What is the situation with Egypt in this? They are more pro-Saudi these days.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think Egypt is actually that's see, the thing is I trailed off on the previous answer because I forgot to mention Egypt, which is where I should have gone.
Oh,
But thank you for bringing that up. I mean, Mohammed Morsi was a Muslim Brotherhood president, and he was overthrown by the army, and Saudi Arabia supported the coup against him.
mhm.
And so Turkey and Qatar were not happy with that because the Muslim Brotherhood Alliance saw Mohammed Morsi's presidency as being a victory for the Muslim Brotherhood camp. Whereas, uh, Saudi Arabia preferred the previous like status quo,
Mhm.
like for their own reasons. I think part of the reason is also because like, the Muslim Brotherhood ideology is more democratic. And so
Okay.
that represents like a threat to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia feels generally insecure by what I call Republican Islam, whether that's Sunni or whether that's Shia. So, for
Okay.
example, the Islamic revolution in Iran, they're Shia Muslims, of course, but they presented a model called Vilayat al-Faqih, or the guardianship of clerics or jurists.
Mhm.
And the idea is that you have democracy. So there is like, parliamentary democracy in Iran, but above that democracy, you have like these clerics and they make the strategic decisions, they make the foreign policy decisions. And, they have this kind of, they're basically the guardians of the democracy beneath them. And so, yeah, that's the thing. You have this austere caste of clerics, ideologically motivated clerics at the very top. And so that kind of worries Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is an absolutist monarchy. It's the most absolutist monarchy in the world.
Right.
The constitution in Saudi Arabia doesn't mean anything. They have no checks and balances. They have no, parliament that has any significant power. What the king says is word and law. And it's the squabbling princes that determine who the next king is going to be, and they seize power by murdering each other and backstabbing each other, and it's quite a violent. There's a Greek word for it, which is kratocracy, which is like rule by the powerful, right?
Yeah.
And so this kind of leadership, which finds it very hard to legitimize itself, even within the kind of even within like the Islamic sense of like what a legitimate government looks like, is very intimidated by Republican Islam, whether that's Sunni Republican Islam of the kind that the Muslim Brotherhood promotes, or whether that's Shia Republican Islam of the kind that you see in Iran. Now, of course, there's a bit of a contradiction here because, Qatar is also an absolutist monarchy. I just guess that Qatar is more stable than Saudi Arabia because if you look at the borders of Saudi Arabia is a very artificial state. And that's because the ruling families, they all come from the Najd, which is the area surrounding Riyadh, which is the capital. And Riyadh historically was not a prominent city. It was basically just a village. And it was the oil wealth that turned Riyadh in Najd into a major, cosmopolitan center. But, in the northern parts, or the eastern provinces, rather, which is the correct name for it, the eastern provinces are Sharqiya in Saudi Arabia, which is what it's called in Arabic. Mm-hmm. These areas are Shia. Mm-hmm. And the people there are just brutally oppressed. If they protest, they can be put on trial. They can be executed. In fact, like there were 80 executions about a month ago, and many of those people were just Shiites, who were protesting against the government. They can't practice their religion, and it's a terrifying existence that they live under. So Saudi Arabia has to keep them repressed, brutally repressed. Then in the south of Saudi Arabia, in the provinces of Baha, Asir, Jizan, and Najran, which were historically Yemeni provinces, those areas are traditionally Zaydi, which is another kind of branch of Shia Islam. It's like I said, they're the Sunnis of the Shia and the Shia of the Sunnis. You can think of them as like a third branch of Islam, like neither Sunni, neither Shia.
Okay.
But in the geopolitics of today, they're generally aligned with the Shia forces in the Middle East. The reason why Saudi Arabia is intimidated by Zaydi revivalism is because many parts of Saudi Arabia were historically Zaydi, and because there's a huge political difference between Zaydi Islam and the Wahhabism that Saudi Arabia promotes, not only within their borders but across the Muslim world. Wahhabism goes back to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. It goes back to figures like Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was promoting other scholars like Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn Taymiyyah in particular had this one saying where he said 60 years under an oppressive sultan or tyrant is preferable to a single night of anarchy. And so it's basically an ideology that says, look, if you live under an oppressive regime, just tolerate it, because that's better than the anarchy that would follow if that regime were overthrown. Whereas Zaydi Islam, which is the ideology, the Islamic identity of the Ansarullah movement, they preach that Muslims have an obligation to rise up and overthrow corrupt and unjust rulers. So on the one hand, you have Wahhabism, which is very conservative, which says put up with an unjust ruler, whereas Zaydi Islam says that you should rise up against unjust rulers. So naturally, Saudi Arabia feels very, very insecure about any type of Republican, democratic, egalitarian, revolutionary current within Islam, whether it's within Sunni Islam or Shia Islam, it makes no difference to them.
So they would not be too happy with that at all. That's interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Well, thank you for sharing. I actually can't think of, is there anything else you'd like to add? I can't think of anything else. What do you think would be the most important thing for people in the US to understand about this?
We in the West need to call on our governments to recognize the Ansarullah-backed government in the capital, Sana'a, as the legitimate government of Yemen. That would be my final message.
Okay, makes sense. And is there a place people could go for more information on this, or if they want to learn more about this? any scholars or historians you could recommend?
Isa Bloomy is one.
Okay.
He does a lot of good work on this. Check out Marwa Osman's channel. So if you
Okay.
just go to YouTube, type in Marwa Osman, you can find her, and she interviews a lot of people on Yemen. She's interviewed me like probably about a dozen times.
Okay.
You can go to my website, theorientaldespot.com, and
Okay.
in the
Okay.
search bar, just type in Yemen, and you'll find like a long list of articles that I've written.
I'll
You
provide a
can go
link to it.
to the Cradle. You can
Oh
go
yeah,
to the
Cradle is good.
Cradle,
Yes, Pepe Escobar
which is
writes
very
well.
good. He does. He does. And I actually wrote one of the first articles for the Cradle because it was founded by Sharmeen Narwani, who's an excellent journalist. I mean,
Okay.
she was correct on Syria from day one.
Mhm.
Um, she set up the Cradle to be like a pro resistance media network that's extremely professional and and covers news in a very accurate way, but also presents the side of the resistance. And yeah, one of my articles there is the title is something like a checkmate is looming for the Saudis in Yemen. So check that out as well.
Okay, will do. Will do. Well, I thank you very much for your time.
No worries. Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye.